hidden in plain sight.
Welcome back to Season 3 of Hidden in Plain Sight, the broadcast series exploring the mysterious world of Christopher Marlowe, our famed Elizabethan poet, playwright, and spy. I'm Dr. Julian Ng, your host for this series, and joining me again are our resident Marlowe experts, Dr. Peter Hodges and Miss Carol Paxton. Hi, guys.
Julian.
Hello.
And joining us again for the third time is Dr. Rachel Wyfall of St. Peter's University in Jersey City, New Jersey. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Julian. Hi, Carol and Peter.
Today's episode is doubly special because we have with us Dr. Joseph Khoury, professor and chair of the Department of English and editor of Tudor and Stuart texts at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, Canada. Welcome to HIPS, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Julian. Happy to be here.
Well, we're very happy you could join us. Okay. Now that the cast is assembled and the stage is set, let's motor on with the show. Our previous episode raised the temperature, and I guess today's show will be just as exciting. As per the theme of the series, we continue to investigate the possibility that Christopher Marlowe was the author of the Procreation Sonnets, otherwise known as the first 17 sonnets in the collection of 154 first published in 1609 as Shakespeare's sonnets. Well, let's start with you today, Rachel. In our previous episodes, you have played devil's advocate, or perhaps you see it as the angel's advocate, and you have proposed two key things: that the 17 sonnets might well have been written to various individuals rather than one single individual, and that William Shakespeare is their author. In support of this, you've mentioned Erasmus a couple of times as a potential source for the subject matter in these 17 sonnets. Can you elaborate a little on that?
Surely. I have actually a short list of excerpts here, so I'm going to also be referring to a page next to me. But I think, first of all, we might need to introduce Erasmus. So Desiderius Erasmus was born circa 1469 in Rotterdam in then Holland. And he died on July 12th in 1536 in Basel, Switzerland. So he's one of the most famous humanists of this era, of course. He was a Catholic priest, a theologian, philosopher. He translated the New Testament, and he was one of the most influential thinkers of the Renaissance. A letter that he wrote called Encomium Matrimoniae was published in English in Thomas Wilson's The Art of Rhetoric in 1553. And this work would have been familiar to Shakespeare and many English people at the time. It's quite obvious how the author of the sonnets has alluded to Erasmus's letter. The Encomium Matrimoniae was an address to a young man encouraging him to marriage, and there's very obviously alluded to within the sonnets, especially those we call the Procreation Sonnets. So I'll just start with a quote that kind of shows the tenor of this appeal. In you only remaineth the hope of issue and maintenance of your stock, whereupon your friends with one consent have offered you in marriage a gentlewoman of a good house and much wealth, fair of body, very well brought up, and such a one as loveth you with all her heart. But you, either for your late sorrows, which you have in fresh remembrance, or else for religion's sake, have so purposed to live a single life, that neither can you for love of your stock, neither for desire of issue, nor yet for any entreaty that your friends can make, either by praying or by weeping, be brought to change your mind. It is thought that he wrote this actually to his cousin, whose mother had died and sister had gone into a convent. This kind of thought about, creating an heir, creating issue, is referenced many times as Sonnet 3, lines 7 and 8, or who is he so fond will be the tomb of his self-love to stop posterity. We have also Erasmus mentioning posterity in what is more right or meet than to give that unto the posterity, the which we have received of our ancestors. What is more unthankful than to deny that unto younglings the which, if thou hadst not received of thine elders, thou couldst not have been the man living able to have denied it unto them. There's mention in Sonnet 4, the addressee is called a beauteous niggard. He asks, why dost thou abuse the bounteous largesse given thee to give, echoing that sentiment. Also, there's quite a lot of imagery in Erasmus's letter that has to do with farming, growing crops, grafting plants, etc. And of course, these are famously in the procreation sonnets. Therefore, as he is counted no good gardener, that being content with things present, doth diligently prune his old trees, and hath no regard either to imp or graft young sets, because the selfsame orchard, though it be never so well trimmed, must needs decay in time, and all the trees die within few years. So he is not to be counted half a diligent citizen, that being content with the present multitude hath no regard to increase the number. And actually, this particular section of the letter continues on to mention tillage and husbandry, and this famous image of tillage is also from Sonnet 3. Look in thy glass, and tell the face thou viewest, now is the time that face should form another, whose fresh repair, if now thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world, unbless some mother. For where is she so fair, whose uneared womb disdains the tillage of thy husbandry? It's quite some image. A little disturbing. And also in Sonnet 15, we have the mentioning of men as plants increase, and at the end where he says wasteful time debateth with decay, all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you I engraft you new. So we have just many references to nature, but of course the whole collection of sonnets has many images of nature and growth and decline. So that was another argument that was made earlier, that yes, these particular sonnets are very much about encouraging a young man to procreate, for sure. But this obsession with the aging and death of people, and the impermanence of human life versus the hopeful permanence of art, is a preoccupation through much of the collection. And also, just one more thing is there are also many references to the book of Matthew in the procreation sonnets in particular, especially the parable of the talents, which can be summed up in this quote, for unto every man that hath it shall be given, and he shall have abundance, and from him that hath not, even he that shall be taken away. So this is also alluded to in the procreation sonnets, but I won't go on any longer for now. I'd like some responses.
I think that's been fantastic, Rachel. A very interesting look at the whole thing. Peter, what do you think?
Well, I don't disagree at all that Erasmus was available to people in England in English translation. And I think of anyone, it's very likely that Christopher Marlowe, who was a divinity student at Cambridge at Corpus Christi College and was on an MA track to become a priest, for all things, he would certainly be aware of Erasmus, never mind the book of Matthew and all the other books of the Bible. And so a lot of that imagery can work its way into the sonnets, even if he is the composer of those sonnets. If anything, it seems to be more likely that he would be the source, or Marlowe would be the transmitter of all of that, than someone whose education to this day I still cannot trace. Whereas I know a person at Cambridge must have come across Erasmus in his studies at some point, if only in a debate.
Well, that doesn't surprise me at all, what you've just said, Peter. I had a feeling you would say something like that. Carol, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I would always say that I don't think there's ever anything surprising when we see one artist in the broadest possible sense, a writer, a painter, a musician, in their work responding to the work of one of their predecessors, and responding to it by quoting from it, alluding to it, using the same imagery, or in some cases by contradicting it. And of course, Erasmus was, well, possibly the greatest Northern European humanist of the 16th century. I mean, he's an absolutely towering figure. So I think it's entirely probable that the sonnets do respond in many ways to Erasmus's writing. And also, as a sort of aside, I've fairly recently read Roderick Lewis's book, Professor Roderick Lewis, Hamlet and the Vision of Darkness. And I remembered that he refers to Erasmus a lot, and I had a quick look at the index. There are over 50 references to Erasmus in that book on Hamlet, and how Hamlet again responds to humanist intellectual culture. So is Erasmus present in the sonnets? Well, yes. But I think also what Peter said is very important, because if we acknowledge that the presence of Erasmus, a response to Erasmus's work in the sonnets, then we also have to ask ourselves who read Erasmus. And I don't really think that is something that the average person who could read, and that of course is a minority, the average person who could read would be picking up on a bookstall for entertaining reading. They'd be surely far more likely to be reading Robert Greene's latest on coney catching, or something much more lightweight and entertaining, not heavy theology. And there's also a question as well of availability of such books. Cheap pamphlets aside, books were very expensive objects. Libraries that contained numerous volumes were few and far between. The universities, obviously, and the homes of some wealthy individuals who were also had intellectual interests. For example, Burghley had a fairly remarkable library. So, as I say, just to sum up, Erasmus, yes, absolutely. But who was reading Erasmus?
Might I add, though, it is probably would have been read in English translation from the Art of Rhetoric collection.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, but that's still not a cheap pamphlet.
No.
To read for entertainment. And given that the paucity of artificial light, reading for entertainment was to an extent the province of those people with leisure, or people who were scholars who had the time to read, as opposed to being the necessity of basically working all daylight hours. It's not an activity that many people could afford to indulge in.
Thank you, Carol. Joseph, you're new to the conversation. What do you think about all of this? Have we perhaps left out any other potential philosophers? I ask because Marlowe was interested in Plato and Machiavelli, and I know you are too.
Thank you. Yes, there's a lot that has been said, and I'll just make a couple of responses about Erasmus and reading in general and influence in general. There's no question that Erasmus was influential. No one here has denied that, obviously. But the Guardian metaphors that Rachel referred to, I mean, the English were very much into gardening, and those metaphors, for example, Richard II, the gardening metaphor is very strong, and so it's not a surprise that a Shakespeare or anyone else, for that matter, would have picked up on those metaphors and used them in their sonnets or other writings. So that's there. Richard II was, I think, 1595, if I'm not mistaken, about one of two 100% verse plays, the other being King John, which was also written at the same time. So I think that influence is definitely strong. Respecting Shakespeare's reading ability, while he did have a grammar education, we have the curriculum. It's a very strong education. They would have been taught a lot of rhetoric.
I think I have to protest a little there. We don't have the curriculum he was taught. We have a good general idea of what grammar schools taught, but we have absolutely no idea what was taught in Stratford.
Sure, fair enough, but it was a king's school. It was a king's school, and therefore it would not have been taught, not rigidly, if I may put it that way. It was a new king's school, and therefore it would have been fairly well respected, I think.
Well, they sent no boys to universities and no boys to the Inns of Court who were in any shape William Shakespeare's contemporaries.
Well, again, that may be so, but the point is that he would have had a fairly decent education, I think. Even if we don't subscribe to him writing all the plays, as you know, for example, some people are challenging the Henry VI plays, and that's fine. I mean, I don't really dispute or agree. I think it's an interesting question. But even if we subscribe to it, that's still a fairly good, ability. I mean, even if we don't think that the Henry VI plays are great plays, I mean, I think they're perfectly fine. But the fact that he collaborated in itself is a sign that he had a fairly good ability. So I think that's an important question to keep in mind. Again, whether we agree or disagree is a whole other matter. But the other works that he certainly was influenced by would have been a lot of the prose fiction, for example. And those prose works were fairly widely read, Barnaby Rich being one prominent source for several of Shakespeare's plays. Now, did others read them? Of course they did. Did Marlowe read them? Yeah, he probably did. So I think it's a wider question is all I'm saying, really. I'm open to dispute in any of these things, but I think it's an important question to keep in mind that and not everybody necessarily owned books themselves. Sometimes they just pass them around. I think theater companies did the same thing. So I think it's an interesting question. But certainly the gardening metaphors, yes, Erasmus and others, the reading and the sources, huge question. No doubt Marlowe was much better educated than Shakespeare. No one's disputing that, of course. I mean, I adore Marlowe, and I think he was a wonderful poet. But I think we need to keep in mind that just because Shakespeare didn't have a university education doesn't mean that he wasn't capable or well read. I think they're not mutually exclusive, these things.
I would also add that, overall, the works ascribed to Shakespeare are not bookish. There are many references to Ovid. We know, there is definitely a familiarity with mythology and with, many different fields of thought. When you look at a Marlowe play or a Ben Jonson play, we know that Jonson was, university educated as
No,
well.
no, he wasn't actually. Sorry to interrupt. Johnson didn't go to university. He remained a friend and if you like, pupil of Camden's, but
That's right.
he didn't actually attend university.
But
Oh,
definitely
yeah.
there
Yes, he's
there's
your classic autodidact in many ways. Yes,
Much more
absolutely.
pedantic, yeah.
But we ignore at our peril, and there's not so much work on it because it becomes difficult to square with the biographical knowledge. But there are a small but really quite convincing number of books and articles on the influence of Greek drama on the Shakespeare plays, including ones which were not even necessarily available in Latin. There's a man called Earl Sharman, who's actually well known, an Oxfordian, but his work on Greek drama in the Shakespeare plays I found really quite persuasive in places. I don't obviously agree with his final conclusions, but his demonstration that the author of the plays was familiar with Sophocles is, well, I found it convincing. Obviously, not everybody would.
Of course, we have the Comedy of Errors, which is just, an
Dramatist.
adaptation
yeah,
of the Twin
yeah.
Menechmi. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there were.
I do think the because it's a slightly thorny subject. If you wish to match it up with the biography of William Shakespeare, that the classical influence, especially the Greek, is kind of downplayed. And of course, myself included, I mean, I have small Latin and no Greek whatsoever, so I can only comment based on secondary sources.
I have
I can
Google.
only, I can only read Sophocles in English translation. So my ideas are obviously secondhand, but
But that is a general rule, though. I mean, most of the Renaissance was much more versed in Latin than in Greek. I think
quite
that's
because
that's universally acknowledged. You know,
because
but I think where some people might say, wait a minute, Shakespeare couldn't have or could have or whatever. I mean, if you look at, let's say, Othello, the sources for Othello were available, which is Ecce Homoeoe, was available only in Italian and French. It was not available in English, but we know that French was familiar to Shakespeare. He used it in Henry V,
no,
for
that's a
example.
bit circular, isn't it?
But well,
One
it's
can,
not, because being able to read Latin also allows you to read Italian fairly easily.
well, yes, I'd agree. I mean,
So
personal knowledge, I would agree on that.
the Romance languages, are much more neighborly than let's say English, right? So I think it's a bit of a slippery slope sometimes, to suggest that just because, and I don't know the source, Sherman, to say that Greek and therefore most of the authors didn't read Greek, to be honest. It's the
Well,
scholars
no,
certainly
well,
did at
obviously not,
Cambridge,
because
but
it was a language somebody could have studied at university level, or
sure.
alternatively with a private tutor. I mean, for example, Burleigh's wife and her sister, who was, of course, married to Anthony Bacon, were both actually proficient Greek scholars, as were several other aristocratic women.
Well,
all of
Thomas
whom,
More certainly knew
well,
Greek and taught
yes,
his daughter Greek, but
yeah,
but
that's
again,
correct.
that was a very
One of the things I
minimal
love about
thing.
Thomas More, people are really
Yeah.
horrible about him, but he was wonderful in the way he educated his daughter.
Sure. No,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, we're talking
Yeah.
about a tiny thing. An interesting question for me about Marlowe, for example, and his sources is, in Tamburlaine, we know most of the sources that made their way into Tamburlaine, with one exception, and that's the Arabic sources. Now, we
Oh,
know
yeah.
which Arabic
If
sources, but he actually was fairly accurate. We don't know that he read Arabic. We know that Arabic was taught at Cambridge when he was there, but we don't know whether he read the Arabic, but certainly the sources somehow made their way into Tamburlaine, and they're fairly accurate. Now, I read Arabic, but I couldn't, say, you know, where he got them. My theory is that he either knew somebody who was very familiar with the Arabic through the spy network, or you know, he talked to travelers who were
Or
familiar with those Arabic sources.
perhaps
But we have
that's
no
what,
evidence that he read Arabic.
but perhaps
You
he
know,
ended up in the spy network because he had learned to read Arabic.
I need to break in. I've let this
Yeah.
go for a long time, and we're really wandering off topic.
Yeah, we are.
Mm,
And as much as I would like to let this go, we do have time on our mind. So I want to bring this
sure.
back to the sonnets themselves and less of a discussion about the potential. I mean, the potential source from Erasmus, I think we can all agree on, and we can all agree on the potential source from the Bible, any number of ways in which those two sources could be threaded into a poetic work that itself has considerable range. There are two things that I think we need to focus on, one of which is when these things were written. And the other thing is a point that I want to make, which Joseph and Rachel, you both sort of made, is that the current academic position on Shakespeare and his career as a writer is one that generally assumes that he worked in collaboration with others. The extent to the amount of collaboration that he did is still being studied in all corners. And in each and every one of these plays, we can find people who are going to tell you that he either worked with George Peele on it, or he worked with Thomas Middleton on it, or he might have worked with Thomas Kidd on it. The one that we actually have real academic strong support for most recently is this business of Henry VI, where there seems to be coalescing around the notion that Marlowe was author of upwards of half of that trio of plays. And of course, we have the precedent plays in that series being the contention between the houses of York and Lancaster and the true tragedy of Richard III, both of which were in print in 1594 and 95 without anybody's name on them. And so the notion that Shakespeare and Marlowe were close collaborators has been formed over many decades of research within the Academy. And they also support the notion that in some fashion, the unpublished Hero and Leander was shared with Mr. Shakespeare prior to his composing Venus and Adonis, because there's an awful lot of parallels, both in the source material being Ovid, the theme of the two poems, the imagery, and a lot else that's inside Venus and Adonis that appears to have been taken straight out of, in some cases, outright quotes from Hero and Leander. So when we look at it from that frame, then it seems to me there's there's a good reason to make an argument that Shakespeare may not have been the author of all of the sonnets that eventually appeared under his name. We have the precedent example of Passionate Shepherd, where Shakespeare's name was given to a booklet of 12 poems, only 3 of which can actually be traced and are agreed to be by him. There are many others in the collection that we know were by other authors, and they didn't get credit. So with that example, then we can take a look at the sonnets, and we can take a look at the first 17, which is where I want to draw our focus, to ask the question, if given all the other material that we've provided here, Marlowe's interest in sonnet writing, Harrington's confirmation of that interest, the inclusion of source material that was not necessarily unique to Marlowe, but which Marlowe seems to have stressed more than any other writer, being Ovid, him having translated the Amours and so forth, which also lent information and themes and color to the sonnets. Is it not possible that Christopher Marlowe was the author of those 17 sonnets, if in fact Lord Burleigh needed to give a gift, which he totally did, on the 18th birthday of Southampton? Would he have not commissioned 17 sonnets to give him on the 17th birthday, when he was making notes to that effect and negotiating with the parents and grandparents of the boy at that self-same time? That's the position that we're taking here, and I just would like to try to get you guys to address that. So, Rachel, have at it.
Well, I believe I made the point earlier that we don't have a body of sonnets from Christopher Marlowe. We don't have a known tendency for him to write sonnets, and not to say that he couldn't or didn't, and also though that if we're going to say that the first 17 are not written by the same person who wrote the subsequent sonnets in that collection, we also have to take into consideration that themes, not maybe overtly the procreation exactly, the fixation on procreation, it definitely is, within those sonnets, but then other themes in them continue on, afterwards. And also we have to look stylistically as well. That do these sonnets seem not to belong with the rest of the collection? Or do you think Marlowe wrote other sonnets in the collection that he has not been given credit for? Many questions arise.
I'm
I
sorry.
think that also refers to your earlier point, Rachel, where you said that it might have been written to a bunch of different people. So then they might not necessarily have to follow a similar theme if they're written to different people. Joseph, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting questions that Peter raised. But I'll take the first one, the first question, which you just alluded to, Julian. I, I don't think one can conclude that the sonnets were written to one person in particular, or that they're written to any person. I think that they could easily be read as fiction. If we look at all the number of characters that are in Shakespeare's plays, there are over 1,200 of them. So, these could be different characters in the sonnets as well. So I don't know that we can conclude that they are written to a specific person. They may have been, I don't know, but they could also have been written to a number of people or to nobody in particular. So I think that's a consideration at least. Regarding the Marlowe, I mean, he was obviously a brilliant poet. There's no question. I would never ever deny that. I adore Marlowe, and I think he needs to be studied more and more all the time. But he also parodied himself. And really where I'm going to is that a lot of the poets in those days did mimic one another. People in the Renaissance, as we all know, focused on two things, imitatio and emulatio. You imitate to show your learning, but you also try to emulate, to try to improve upon it or extend it, And I think they all did that. So there are many similarities among many poets. I think the key is to try to do something that's a little bit different to make you stand out a little bit more. With respect to the sonnets, I mean, I think there are a number of questions. Can we even conclude that these 17 sonnets were written at the same time? Maybe, but we can't confirm that either, right? So I think I think Rachel's point about we don't really know if they were written to one person or many, I think is an important consideration. I don't know that we can prove it, to be honest. I'm not sure that that's possible. But it doesn't mean that they that they weren't written by one person for one person. It could be, and it could be otherwise.
I have made the point earlier too that I believe the figure is that in only a fifth of the sonnets is the gender of the addressee specified.
Right, right. That's true. Yes, that is an important consideration. There are schools of thought that insist that they want to prove Shakespeare's sexual orientation, for example. I don't know that that's even relevant, to be honest. I mean, who cares, first of all? But the point is, can you actually prove it? I don't think that it's necessarily doable, and I don't think it's relevant. I really don't care, what I mean. In the Renaissance, they didn't have the concepts that we abide by today either, So there was no such thing as homosexuality as a concept, right? Or heterosexuality. I think they just, they talked about sodometry instead of, I mean, so I don't think it's relevant. My concept is, which was just recently published, is that a lot of scholarship today tends to retroject. They wanna impose our values on the past,
Yes,
and
yes,
yeah,
very
it's
true,
not that's
very
not a
true.
good thing to do,
No.
because it closes doors of interpretation for us,
This
or
also
understanding.
Yes, I mean, after all, nowadays we giggle at the Victorian bowdlerization, but we think, gosh, isn't that the awful thing to do? But we have our own version of it. We just can't see it.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Carol, I'm going to let you have the last word for this episode.
The one thing that I think does appear to be true about the sonnets is that, very roughly speaking, you can see in the versification, etc., a certain linearity. And I would say that the lower numbered ones are earlier than the later numbered ones, not in a exact sense, but there does appear to be something of a chronological order of composition in them. Whether that gets us anywhere, I'm not really sure.
I want to pick up. No, I want to pick up on that. First of all, this discussion shows us how difficult this subject is to stay on point, because no sooner do we start talking about the 17 sonnets than suddenly the lens widens out to all the other sonnets, and then the lens widens further to all the plays, and then the next thing you know, we're talking about toilets at John Harrington's house. And one really wants to zero in on those first 17 sonnets as a subject unto themselves. That's my point here.
And you can't, though. You have to bring in other context.
No, you do not. No, you do not. Because the very first question I asked about all of this is there any reason, given those 17 sonnets, anything about them at all that would cause you, by their own nature, to look for any other source or anything else outside of them, to presuppose that there was someone who wrote more than those 17 sonnets? Nope. I got the floor. Now, we have those 17 sonnets. They are 1 through 17. Anybody who wants to disassemble those sonnets needs to make the case that they should be disassembled on the basis of themselves. If you look at these things and they read as a complete self-contained composition, you have no reason to look outside of them. There's nothing within them that says, oh, by the way, read note 13 in sonnet 147 in order to explain what I just said in sonnet 17. No, they are there. That's what they are. Now, we're all sitting here speculating and muddying the waters as far as I'm concerned, which is fun to do. But, if you accept the fact that you have 17 sonnets, that's what's nailed to the wall in the room. You have to figure out what they are. You're not going to be allowed to reach outside those sonnets unless they indicate to you that you should. That's my.
But they do, Peter.
Okay. Tell me where that happens.
So there are references in those sonnets to playwriting, to stage and shows and that kind of thing, which other sonnets also do. So in other words, they reference the art of playmaking or acting essentially. Those metaphors are throughout all the sonnets, really. I mean, not every sonnet, but they recur in different sonnets, as they do in I think
So in
if I
other
can.
words, you're saying that the sonnets suggest themselves that they were written by someone familiar with the theater.
Well, I am, but I'm also suggesting that the other sonnets in the 154 also do that. So not just,
I'll
I can
give you
point
that.
to,
That's a
yeah.
good one. I like
So,
that.
well, I mean, and absolutely, and yes, I know where you're going with this. Of course, Marlowe wrote plays,
And
as
so did
did Shakespeare.
Shakespeare.
So, yeah, so my point is that it's not. I'm in agreement with Rachel here. We cannot not look at other sonnets to reference sonnets 1 to 17. There are three immediately pop to my mind about plays, and that's sonnets 5, 11, and 15. They reference play writing. Sonnet 17 famously references poem writing, numbers and
Mm-hmm,
that kind of thing, right?
mm-hmm,
So,
mm-hmm.
that context, I think, is important. Now, that doesn't mean that those sonnets were written at the same time. I stand, on that argument. We cannot prove that. The famous sonnet that presumably puns on Anne Hathaway or Hathaway. I can't remember which number it is. Anyone remember? I mean, so it could have been written when he was a young man in love. Who knows? I mean, I don't.
It
I
could
can't
be
prove that,
nothing.
but
It could be
but
nothing at
yeah.
all.
Of
Well,
If
it
course,
you're
we
could,
also
right?
have the sonnets that play on the name Will.
Yes, I love those sonnets. I do love those sonnets.
That's what that means. That's what that
I think
means,
I'm gonna have
I
folks.
to
think we'll
cut that
edit that
bit
Any
out.
out.
questions
Well,
about
it's
that?
at least one of them. I've now forgotten the number myself as well. You can happily read as saying that you have driven me so absolutely crazy with desire. You've actually made me the my hated pseudonym.
Well, as
Oh.
expected, this was another great, exciting episode. Tune into our next episode when we get Rachel's class in for some questions and answers. In the meantime, if you're impatient and want to get a jump ahead, get a copy of Marlowe's Complaint, the book that kick-started it all. See you in the next episode.
Hidden in plain sight.